I'm always trying to cover and develop stories that are relevant in these seemingly crazy days that we live in. And I assure you, today's video is going to really challenge and stretch your mind. And this is a direct reaction to this other video I released a couple of weeks ago about just how good you have to be to go to heaven. Now, within that video, I made a statement that, well, for a lot of people, it just didn't make sense, or it might have rubbed people the wrong way. What I said was, hell is the default for everyone born under the curse of Adam and Eve. So, I received a comment that is actually a very common reaction. Can you guess what that might be? It's not fair that everyone is going to hell. It's not fair that hell is the default. Now, maybe you've heard other people say this, or maybe you've actually heard the other common argument. Well, how can a loving God send people to hell? Maybe even you yourself think this or thought like this at one time. And look, I get that. Because after all, you didn't ask to be born, much less born into a sinful world. And yet, here you are. And from that logic, look, it makes perfect sense. But if you watched that video, you would have also heard me talk a lot about sin and how, just like the law of gravity that says, well, what goes up must come down, there is a non-negotiable price that must be paid for each person's sin. And either you will pay for it with an eternal price, or you will allow Jesus to pay for it. So allow me to unpack this quite a bit more. And to do this, we need to take a look at Genesis and the beginning of humanity. Now, if we go to Genesis 2 and look at the account of Eve being formed, it says, starting in verse 22, "And the rib that the Lord God had taken from the man, he made into a woman and brought her to the man. Then the man said, 'This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh.' And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed." Now, there's two takeaways that I want to point out here. The first is to point out verse 24. "A man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." What the Bible is talking about is sex and procreation. And this is actually repeated several times throughout the Bible. Now, the second thing I want to emphasize is verse 25, how they were naked and not ashamed. Now, the reason why they were not ashamed is because, well, there was no sin, not yet. And they had never even conceived the notion that they were naked to begin with. And we know this by reading Genesis 3:11, where God asked Adam, "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten of the tree which I commanded you not to eat?" That tree being, well, the tree of knowledge. In fact, if we just look for a moment at verse 4 and 5, we see that what Satan had actually said to Eve. "But the serpent said to the woman, 'You will not surely die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.'" Did you ever consider for a moment that, well, this was not a lie? Satan said, "You will surely not die." And look, this is correct. Your spirit and soul will not die. And the next verse about knowing good from evil. Again, this was not a lie because in that moment, they had the knowledge of being naked. This was sin entering the world. However, both Adam and Eve were certainly deceived. So let's continue with chapter 3 and the punishment that God delivered. And we need to pay very close attention to some of the details here. We read in verse 15 one of the ways Satan was punished. "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Did you ever consider what that meant? Your seed and her seed. Now look, just put a pin in that for a moment. Eve's punishment continues in verse 16. To the woman, he said, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain, you shall bring forth children. Now, I want you to think, why would God say this? And more importantly, how would Eve know this was a punishment to begin with? So also put a pin in that one. Let's now jump to verses 21 through 24 that says, also for Adam and his wife, the Lord God made tunics of skin and clothed them. Then the Lord God said, behold, the man has become like one of us to know good and evil. And now, lest he put out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever. Therefore, the Lord God sent him out of the Garden of Eden to till the ground from which he was taken. So he drove out the man and placed cherubim at the east of the Garden of Eden and a flaming sword which turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. So let's get back to the verse 21. It says, God made tunics of skin. Other versions say, well, garments of skin or coats of skins. Now, I know most people look at this and assume God made animal skins for Adam and Eve, but did you ever consider the body we all have, our flesh? But isn't it possible that it was in that moment that mankind took on the form of the body that we know? After all, we are soul, spirit, and body, but this body dies with a spirit and soul that lives for eternity. And if God is perfect, then why would we have a body that perishes? Now consider God and company and how Adam and Eve were sent out from the Garden of Eden, assumedly a place of perfection. Was this right? Or was this just plain mean? Well, consider what they said. Mankind now knew good and evil. And as it states in verse 22, if they then ate from the tree of life, they would then live forever with their sin. You see, it's my belief kicking Adam and Eve out of the garden was actually an act of compassion. Because to live forever in a body that withers, well, what would that look like? Now let's circle back to Eve and having increased pain during childbirth. How would Eve know this was a punishment? Now, I'm going to present something here that could be considered incredibly controversial, but just hang in there because for some, this may just blow you away. I suggest this verse infers that Adam and Eve were possibly having children before the first sin and that Cain and Abel were not their first children. You see, the Bible does not talk about how much time went by from the creation to the eating of that fruit. And it is assumed that Cain and Abel were, well, the first. But consider a time when Adam and Eve were pure and without sin. If they had children, they would have no blemish. Adam and Eve partake of this fruit and then take on sin and they're cursed. And then every child born from that point on is cursed. They are sinful. And this is confirmed in Romans 5:12. Therefore, just as through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, and thus death spread to all man because all sinned. Look, you and I are the offspring from this original sin. Now you might ask, if this is true, well, what happened to all those children? Look, honestly, I don't know. I don't have a great answer for this. But I would also push back and ask, well, if that's true, where's the Garden of Eden? Look, it's possible that there's another dimension that we cannot see, and maybe this is the third heaven as spoken of in the Bible. But for the sake of not going down a deep rabbit hole, let's just leave that one right there. But let's now go back to verse 15 and how it states, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. Now, look, we're starting to swim in the deep end of the pool when we break this one down. And if you follow someone like L.A. Marzulli, he talks about how this is procreation between fallen angels and women. Hard to grasp, I know, but let's look at Genesis 6. Now it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. Now understand, the sons of God, they were the fallen angels. And indeed, they were procreating with mankind. And we know this for certain. Reading verse 4, there were giants on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God, or the fallen angels, came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Look, it's very clear. And these children were called the men of renown, also known as the Nephilim. Look, these were very wicked times. And we know just how God felt about this, continuing with verses 5 through 7. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. So the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping thing and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. Can you even imagine a perfect God being sorry? It's actually hard to fathom. And we read here, he had every intent of destroying what he made. But then we also see here God's compassion starting in verse 8. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. So why did God decide to spare Noah and his offspring? Well, verse 9 says, Noah was just a man perfect in his generations. Noah walked with God. The English Standard Version says Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. This is actually very important to point out. Blameless in his generation. Consider what this means. You've got wickedness all around you. Fallen angels having children with mankind, which is considered an abomination, and grieving God greatly to the point where he's just ready to wipe everyone and everything out. Noah and his children, they were the only generation on earth that hadn't mixed their seed with Satan's seed. And so God, in his compassion for mankind, chose to spare Noah and his children. God didn't have to do this. He could have just said, that's it. And yet, out of potentially millions of people on the earth, God saw these 8 people and spared them. Would it have been easier just to start with a clean slate? Well, maybe. Could there be a whole bunch of people untainted by sin that God could have just moved on with? Well, absolutely. It's plausible, as I stated before. But the point I keep wanting to illustrate here is that we cannot fathom his depth of compassion. You see, it's a cop-out to just say, it's not fair for people to go to hell, because we all have choice. You see, it's not God that sends you to hell, but rather your unwillingness to acknowledge your sin and do something about it. Hell was not made for mankind. And we see that in Matthew 25:41. Depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. Hell was made for the devil and his angels. And I believe God is compassionate towards mankind and gives mankind a second chance, because no one has seen the glory of God, not mankind. The angels, however, knew this. They've seen God in his fullness already. So for them, there is no second chance. And I believe that if we were to see the glory of God right now compared to our sin, we would likely be dropping to our knees, begging God to forgive us and cleanse us from this sin. And here's where I want to wrap things up by readdressing the fairness of people going to hell. But what I'm going to tell you just might be the most comforting thing you've ever heard. I keep pointing out just how compassionate and forgiving God is, even when he never had to be. And so God, purely out of compassion for his own creation, gave his only son, Jesus, to take the penalty of sin. Now, I know you've likely heard about Jesus and perhaps atonement for sins before, but I want to direct you to Hebrews 2. Since the children have flesh and blood, he too, Jesus, shared in their humanity so that by his death, he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is, the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. For surely it is not angels he helps, but Abraham's descendants, us. For this reason, he had to be made like them, fully human in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God, and that he might make atonement for the sins of the people. So many people think the Bible is just a bunch of stories with a whole bunch of rules to follow. And if you don't follow those rules, you go to hell. I'm saying no. The Bible is a roadmap to being redeemed and being brought back into the perfect fold of God's grace. And out of compassion for mankind, God sacrificed his son Jesus as the ultimate sacrifice to take on yours and my sin. And if you didn't catch it, for those of you who fear death, verse 15 nails it. Jesus came to free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. Once you allow Jesus to atone for your sin, there is no more need to fear death. It's done. You see, the God of the universe created all of this. It's his will to do whatever he likes. He could wipe people away. He could just give up on a sinful world and start from scratch. And yet, purely out of love and compassion for his own creation, God provided a way to be redeemed. And that's only through his son, Jesus. Could God force everyone to love him? Well, perhaps, but God doesn't want robots either. Consider the ultimate act of love, which is choice and free will. God desires for all to be saved, but yet loves you enough to not interfere with your free will. Will God woo you and cause things to happen to get your attention? Well, absolutely yes. In fact, it's actually possible, but that you're watching this video as a result of, well, happenstance. But at the end of the day, you are still the one that has to make a choice. And that's my word of the day. This was a big one, folks, with a lot to unpack. And look, I hope you'll go back and rewatch this, as some of the concepts I presented, well, they could be considered pretty out there. And I'll accept the fact that I could be wrong on some of the finer details, but if it's in the Bible, it's in there for a reason. Thank you all so much for giving me a voice here. And if you think someone will be blessed by hearing this word today, please be sure to pass it on. And I would encourage you to also like this video and subscribe, as it helps with the algorithm. After all, folks, we just need to get the message of truth to the people while we still can. And that's it. I hope to see you all next time.